Just before the divorce, one last night of love changed everything forever. Welcome to Alcott's Stories, where love, betrayal, and redemption collide in the most heart-wrenching tales. We're thrilled to have you join our family of storytellers, whether you're a long-time follower or a fresh face here. Your presence means the world to us, and we can't wait to take you on an emotional roller coaster that will leave you thinking long after the video ends. To our returning viewers, welcome back. Your loyalty fuels our passion to create more stories that resonate with your hearts. And to all the new faces, this is just the beginning. Together, we're about to dive deep into the world of raw emotions, love, and life's most unpredictable twists. Let your heart feel every word. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another emotional journey. For our loyal Alcott family, share this story with someone who needs a little hope or healing, because every view, like, and share helps us grow together. Now dive in today's story. The divorce papers lay on the table. A single signature was all it would take to end everything. Years of love, laughter, and sacrifice reduced to ink on a page. Alexander Steele, the billionaire CEO known for his ruthless business mind, sat across from the woman who once meant everything to him. Isabella, his wife, the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing, the woman who loved him when the world ignored him. And yet, here they were, strangers sitting at the same table, about to erase everything they had built together. The room was silent, except for the ticking clock that seemed to count down the final moments of their marriage. Isabella's hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay strong. She had cried enough. She had begged enough. She would not break in front of him again. But just as Alexander reached for the pen, she spoke. "Before we sign this, I have one last request." His hand stopped mid-air. His piercing blue eyes met hers. "A request?" he asked, his voice laced with indifference. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I want one last night with you. Just you and me. No lawyers, no anger, no past. Just one night." Alexander let out a breath, a ghost of a smirk forming. "One last night?" he repeated, as if the idea was amusing. She didn't waver. "Yes. After that, I won't ask for anything. I'll let you go." For a moment, silence filled the air between them. Then, against all logic, against all reason, Alexander agreed. He didn't know it yet, but this night would change everything. The golden chandelier flickered above them, its soft light failing to dissolve the heavy darkness that had settled in the room. The luxurious dining table between them, once a place of shared laughter and stolen glances, now felt like an insurmountable wall. Isabella sat still, her fingers tracing the delicate embroidery on the white linen tablecloth. The air was thick with tension, an unbearable silence stretching between them, filled with all the words left unspoken. Across from her, Alexander Steele sat like a statue, unmoved, indifferent. His sharp jawline, once softened by smiles meant only for her, was now clenched in silent impatience. His steel blue eyes, once burning with passion, now held nothing but cold detachment. The world saw a billionaire CEO, a man of power, success, and influence. But she saw a stranger who once whispered promises against her skin, a stranger who once traced love letters on her back in the middle of the night, a stranger who had once chosen her. But not anymore. The untouched food on the table had long gone cold, just like their love. The divorce papers lay before them, staring back like a death certificate of their marriage. Alexander, dressed in a tailored black suit, exuded an air of finality. His Rolex-clad wrist rested on the table, inches away from the pen that would officially erase her from his life. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and for a fleeting second, Isabella wondered if it was her, the other woman, Her throat tightened. She wasn't supposed to feel this broken. She had known this was coming. She had felt it creeping in like a slow, merciless storm, the way his kisses faded, the way his touch became hesitant, the way his voice lost its warmth. And yet, knowing didn't make it hurt any less. Alexander exhaled sharply, dragging his fingers through his perfectly styled dark hair before reaching for the pen. "This is for the best, Isabella," he murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. "For who?" she wanted to ask. "For you. For her. For the world that only sees your success and not the wreckage of our love." She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing her trembling lips into stillness. Then, just as his fingers wrapped around the pen, she spoke. "Before you do this, I want one last night with you." Her voice was soft, yet it sliced through the silence like a dagger. Alexander's hand froze, the pen hovering above the line where he was meant to sign away their marriage, his brows furrowed slightly, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. He finally lifted his gaze, staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "One night?" he echoed, his lips curling slightly, a smirk that held neither humor nor warmth. She nodded, steady despite the storm raging inside her. "After that, I'll let you go." Her voice did not waver. She expected him to scoff, to reject her, to tell her she was being ridiculous. But instead he leaned back in his chair, studying her, measuring her. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Finally, he exhaled, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. Then, with a single nod, he agreed. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with something unreadable. "One last night." But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that this night would change everything. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers still resting on the divorce papers. He should have signed them. He should have ended this, clean, quick, efficient. That's what he had told himself. That's what he had planned. But Isabella's voice had cut through the finality of it all, halting him in a way he hadn't expected. One last night. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a desperate attempt to cling to something that had already crumbled. No, it was something else, something he couldn't quite place. His first instinct was to refuse. He had already moved on, or at least that's what he convinced himself. There was another woman. She was younger, breathtaking, everything the media adored. She had been by his side at galas, whispering sweet, empty things in his ear while photographers captured the perfect angles. She knew how to stroke his ego, how to fit into his world. But she didn't know him, not the way Isabella did. Still, wasn't Isabella supposed to be in his past? He glanced at her across the table, expecting desperation in her eyes, expecting vulnerability, but that's not what he found. Her deep brown eyes held something else entirely, a quiet storm, an unshaken dignity that unnerved him. There was no begging, no pleading. She simply waited, as if she knew something he didn't. And for the first time in months, Alexander hesitated. Would one night really change anything? Would it matter? He told himself it wouldn't. And yet, he agreed. "Fine," he said, his voice low, steady, unbothered, or at least that's how he wanted it to sound. She nodded, her expression unreadable. And as she stood from the table, her silk dress flowing behind her, Alexander had no idea that this night would break him. No idea that after tonight he would never see Isabella the same way again. No idea that in the end he would be the one left shattered. The bedroom was quiet except for the soft rustling of fabric as Isabella slipped the silk dress over her skin. His favorite dress, the one he used to peel off her body with a hunger that now belonged to someone else. It fit her perfectly, just like she had once fit perfectly in his life. But now she was an afterthought, a discarded love story, a woman he was about to erase with a signature. She inhaled sharply, willing herself to stay composed. Tonight wasn't about winning him back. It wasn't about fighting for something that was already gone. It was about showing him what he had destroyed. She stepped in front of the mirror, running her hands over the smooth fabric. The deep crimson color hugged her curves, accentuating everything Alexander once worshipped. But as she met her own reflection, she felt it, the emptiness inside. She was dressed to kill, but inside she was barely breathing. He broke her, piece by piece, lie after lie, until all that was left was this version of her, a woman who had learned to smile through heartbreak. But tonight, she wouldn't let him see her pain. She would give him one last memory, and then she would let him live with it. With her chin lifted, she walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to something inevitable. Alexander was standing near the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was waiting, expecting, but when he turned to face her, he froze. For the first time in a long time, his breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the glass as his eyes roamed over her, lingering in places they had once claimed as his own. Something flickered in those cold, steel-blue eyes, something unspoken, something dangerous. But just as quickly, he masked it with indifference. He lifted his glass to his lips, taking a slow sip as if unaffected, as if she was just another woman in a beautiful dress. But she saw it. The flicker of tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the glass just a little too tightly, the way his breath had faltered for a fraction of a second. She still had that power over him, and he hated it. But what he didn't know was that tonight, she wasn't here to remind him of what he lost. She was here to show him what he could never get back, and that would haunt him forever. The scent filled the air before he even stepped into the dining room. His favorite meal. Alexander hesitated at the doorway, gripping the frame for a fleeting second as a memory clawed its way back into his mind. Her laughter echoing through the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, the way she used to taste the sauce with the tip of her finger before teasingly pressing it against his lips. Back then, he had told her he could live off her cooking forever. Forever. The word was bitter now. He cleared his throat, shaking off the unwanted memory before walking inside. The table was set. Candles flickered, casting golden hues across the room, creating the illusion of warmth. But the warmth was gone. And then he saw her. Isabella sat there, poised, elegant, yet hauntingly distant. She wasn't dancing around the kitchen like she used to. She wasn't waiting for him with that radiant smile. She wasn't his anymore, and for some reason that realization sat uncomfortably in his chest. "You cooked," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. She simply nodded. "It's our last dinner together. I thought it was fitting." Last dinner. The words echoed in his head, heavier than they should have been. He sat down, his fingers tracing the silverware absently, his gaze locked on the plate in front of him. Everything was just as he liked it. The seasoning, the portions, the details only someone who truly knew him would get right. It should have felt like a meal. Instead, it felt like a farewell. He picked up the fork, but his hand stalled. Did he even deserve this? Did he deserve this moment? This glimpse of the past, wrapped in something so painfully beautiful? She watched him, her expression unreadable. And then, finally, he took a bite. The second the flavors hit his tongue, it happened. Memories, rushing in like an unstoppable tide. The nights she'd wait up for him, a warm meal always ready despite how late he came home. The mornings she'd make his coffee just the way he liked it, slipping a kiss against his jaw before whispering, "Don't work too hard today, love." The times he had walked in, exhausted, and found her dancing in the kitchen, twirling barefoot on the cold tiles, pulling him into a world that felt untouched by stress, by responsibility, by anything but love. His grip on the fork tightened. Damn it, he had forgotten what it felt like to be loved like that, and now the woman who had given him all of that was leaving. He swallowed, forcing the food down past the sudden tightness in his throat. Silence stretched between them, heavy, unforgiving. Isabella took slow, deliberate bites, her posture perfect, her face calm, but it was the silence that screamed the loudest, because once upon a time this table had been filled with laughter, with conversation, with love. Now it was filled with everything left unsaid. Alexander set his fork down, his appetite suddenly gone. For the first time in a long time, he found himself staring at her, really staring. Had she always been this breathtaking? Had she always carried this quiet strength beneath the softness he had once taken for granted? Had he been so blind, so foolish, that he hadn't realized what he was losing until now? A slow, burning ache spread through his chest, and as Isabella lifted her glass to her lips, her eyes meeting his over the candlelight, he knew. This wasn't just a meal. It was a memory she was giving him, one final gift before she walked away. And for the first time that night, he wasn't sure if he wanted to let her go. The soft, melancholy notes of a piano filled the room, a melody that once felt like home, now like a slow death. The lights were dim, just enough to cast shadows that danced along the walls, as if mocking him. Isabella stood there, poised and graceful, as if the passage of time hadn't worn on her. She wasn't broken. She wasn't the desperate woman who once clung to him for answers. She was whole, and in that moment, Alexander realized how much he had let her slip away. She extended her hand. "One last dance, Alex." Her voice was soft, a whisper in the midst of everything they had lost. He could have refused. He could have stood there, cold, distant, and let the night unfold without giving her this final moment. But something in the way her eyes held his, a quiet pleading, a gentle invitation, pulled him in. His gaze flickered to her outstretched hand. She didn't ask for his forgiveness. She didn't beg for his love. She only asked for this one last, fragile piece of their history. Without a word, his hand found hers, and he let her guide him onto the floor. The moment his hands found her waist, it was like the floodgates opened. The ghosts of their past rushed back, memories of late nights wrapped in each other's arms, of stolen kisses in the kitchen, of whispered secrets in the dark. Her warmth, her scent, the way her body pressed so perfectly against his. It was as if nothing had changed, as if time hadn't tried to pull them apart. But everything had changed. For months, Alexander had told himself that he no longer loved her. He had convinced himself that the distance between them was permanent, that the cracks in their marriage were irreparable. But now, as she swayed in his arms, he felt it all crash down. Her fingers gently grazed his neck, her touch soft but steady, and with each subtle movement he was reminded of the life they had shared. The life he had thrown away in pursuit of everything that now felt meaningless. Her breath was warm against his chest, her heart beating just beneath the fabric of his shirt. The closeness of her presence shattered the facade he had spent so long building. Every second of their shared silence, every sway of the dance, cut through him like a blade. He could feel his resolve slipping. How long had he ignored the pull of this love, this woman? How long had he pretended that it didn't matter? The weight of his mistake was unbearable. His throat tightened as he fought to keep his composure, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't stop the flood of emotions that rose, threatening to consume him. For months, he had told himself that he didn't care, but now, in this dance, he realized that it had always been her. She had always been the one, the light that had burned so brightly in his life, and he had extinguished it with his own hands. Isabella's eyes were closed, as if she too were lost in the past, in the love that once felt so pure, so simple. And as they swayed, the weight of what he had done crushed him. He didn't deserve her. He never had. But she was here, with him, for one final dance. And he couldn't stop the tears that welled up in his eyes, no matter how hard he tried. He wanted to apologize, to beg for her forgiveness, but his voice failed him. She didn't need his words. She already knew. And just like that, the facade he had built for so long crumbled. The music slowed, the room became quieter, and the world felt like it had stopped spinning entirely. Isabella was in his arms, her body pressed against his, the space between them now non-existent. The rhythm of the dance had dissolved into something more primal, more desperate. But as they swayed, something inside Alexander shifted, something too raw, too real for him to deny. She was his, but she wasn't. She hadn't been for a long time. And still, his heart betrayed him. His hands, which had once held her with love, now seemed like foreign things, trembling against her skin as he struggled to maintain some semblance of control. But there was no control in this moment. There was only the ache, the longing that he couldn't push away. Isabella's breath hitched as she looked up at him. Her eyes were clouded, filled with an emotion he couldn't place. Sadness, resignation. Her lips parted slightly as if to say something, but no words came. And in that silence, in the stillness of the night, everything in Alexander seemed to snap. He leaned in, closer than he should have, drawn by an invisible force that he had no defense against. He knew what this was. He knew this moment had been poisoned by their past, by everything he had destroyed, and yet he kissed her. His lips met hers in an explosion of need, a collision of regret, longing, and loss. It wasn't a tender kiss. It wasn't a kiss of rekindled love or hope. It was a kiss of war, a battle between the love they had once shared and the resentment that had grown like a dark cloud between them. His lips were desperate, bruising against hers as he pulled her closer, as if trying to make up for years of mistakes in one fractured, reckless moment. But it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. She didn't kiss him back at first. She stood rigid in his arms, her eyes shut tight, the tears gathering on her lashes like fragile glass. The pain in her body was palpable, and yet she let him do this, let him pull her back into the past they could never have again. And then, just as quickly as it had started, she softened. Her lips moved against his, tentative at first, then more urgent, as if she was searching for something that would never be found. Her tears began to fall. One by one, they slipped down her cheeks, leaving behind trails of raw sorrow. Alexander felt them, felt each drop like a dagger piercing through the shield he had built around his heart. She was crying. Tears he had caused, tears that had been locked away for too long. In that moment, he tasted the damage he had done, the damage he had refused to see, the damage that no amount of power, no number of deals or contracts could ever fix. He pulled away from her, his chest heaving, the weight of his own self-loathing suffocating him. Isabella didn't speak, she didn't move. She just stared at him with those tear-filled eyes, and in them he saw the woman he had destroyed, the woman who had once loved him with everything she had. He had broken her. He had betrayed her. And now he had kissed her like a man desperate for redemption, but who was too late to earn it. Alexander stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. But Isabella didn't reach for him. She didn't chase him. She simply wiped away the tears that continued to fall, her face a mask of quiet resignation. And in that moment, he knew. He had lost her. Forever. The night seemed to be spiraling into something neither of them could control. The air was heavy, thick with the remnants of their past, each second spent together adding to the unbearable weight that threatened to collapse everything. Alexander still couldn't shake the feeling that the kiss had awakened something deep within him, something that he wasn't sure he wanted to face. But just as the night shifted, just as the fragile thread between them seemed to tremble, Isabella's phone buzzed on the table. She froze. Her eyes darted down to the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The buzzing continued, insistent. She picked up the phone slowly, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it. The screen lit up with a message from her best friend. She clicked it open without thinking, barely registering the fear that clenched her stomach. And then she saw it. A photo. The photo that would shatter everything. It was him, Alexander. He was standing in a dimly lit restaurant, laughing at something the other woman had said. The woman was young, stunning, the kind of woman that seemed to belong in Alexander's perfect, flawless world. But what made Isabella's breath catch in her chest was the fact that they were holding hands, and wrapped around the other woman's neck was the same necklace Alexander had once given her, the one with the diamond pendant that had symbolized his love for her, the one she had worn on their wedding day. Her heart stopped. It felt like a dagger had pierced through her chest. The phone slipped from her fingers, and the world seemed to collapse in on her. For a split second, there was nothing but silence, the deafening quiet of betrayal sinking deep into her bones. She slowly lifted her gaze from the phone, and when their eyes met, Alexander felt the world around him freeze. Her brown eyes, those eyes he had once known so well, the eyes that had looked at him with such love, such trust, were now filled with rage. But more than that, they were filled with an unbearable heartbreak, a heartbreak that he had caused. "You were still with her." Isabella's voice cracked, her words filled with fury and disbelief. "Even after agreeing to this night, after everything?" Alexander's blood ran cold as the gravity of the situation crashed into him. He opened his mouth to explain, but there were no words, nothing that could undo the damage he had already caused. She stood there, trembling, her lips pressed tightly together, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. And then, to his horror, she let out a bitter laugh, a sound that felt like shards of glass breaking in the air. It was hollow, broken, full of regret and disgust. "God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was such a fool." The words pierced him like nothing else had. His heart twisted, his body filled with an aching emptiness. He had never thought he would see her like this, so broken, so disillusioned. His hand reached out instinctively, but she jerked away from him, her eyes flashing with anger. "No!" she spat, shaking her head. "Don't you dare touch me! You don't get to hold me anymore, not after this!" Her words were like a slap to his face, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen. He had ruined it all, ruined her. "Isabella, He choked on the words, but they couldn't fill the chasm between them. Nothing could. Her face was a mask of pain and fury, her hands trembling as she held herself together. "You were never mine, Alexander. You just didn't want to lose the idea of me, the version of me you had in your perfect little life. But now I see it. You never truly loved me. You just wanted someone to fill the space beside you." He felt as though he had been punched in the gut. The truth stung, and it was a truth he didn't want to accept, but he knew it was real. She had seen it all. She had seen the lies, the deceit, the selfishness that had tainted their love. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to take it all back. But he knew it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done, and she was done. For the first time in their entire relationship, Alexander Steele, the man who could buy anything, who could control everything, was powerless. And Isabella, the woman he had betrayed, was the one holding the power now. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. It was a silence filled with a deep ache, a mourning that Alexander couldn't escape. He had always been a man in control, the CEO, the billionaire. He had everything at his fingertips, the power, the success, the life everyone envied. But in that moment, with Isabella standing before him, broken yet unyielding, he realized something he never thought possible. He had no control over this. Isabella wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her face hardening with a strength he had never seen in her before. The woman who had once been his world, who had loved him unconditionally, was no longer the same. She was someone else now, someone stronger, someone who had finally seen through him. Her eyes locked onto his, and in those eyes he saw everything he had done, every lie, every betrayal, every moment he had taken her for granted, every piece of his soul he had stolen without ever knowing how deeply it would affect her. "I loved you more than life itself," Isabella's voice trembled as she spoke, but there was a finality to her words that cut through him like a blade. "And you threw me away like I was nothing." Nothing. Those words were the final blow. It wasn't just the pain of her tears that tore him apart. It was the knowledge that he had taken the love she had given him, the trust she had placed in him, and crushed it beneath his selfishness. A lump formed in his throat, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Steele didn't know what to do. He had spent so many years manipulating situations, controlling outcomes, bending reality to his will. But here, with Isabella, he had no answers, no power. He opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain? How could he apologize for something that couldn't be undone? He wanted to tell her that he never meant to hurt her, that he had been foolish, selfish, blinded by everything that didn't matter, but those words would never be enough. Nothing would be enough. For the first time, he truly understood what he had lost. It wasn't just a woman. It wasn't just his wife. It was the life they could have had, the family they could have built, the love they could have shared. It was everything. And now it was slipping through his fingers. Her face was unreadable now, her tears gone. She was standing taller than he had ever seen her, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration. She had taken the broken pieces of herself and crafted a strength he hadn't known was possible. She wasn't the same woman who had once depended on him. She wasn't the woman who had blindly given him her heart. She had become something more, something better. Alexander felt his own chest tighten, a wave of regret crashing over him. He had wanted to fix everything. He had wanted to be the man she needed, the man who could make her whole again. But now it was too late. He watched as she turned away, taking a step toward the door. The finality of it hit him like a freight train. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice broken, barely audible. She paused, her back to him. She didn't look at him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out as a raw confession. "I was stupid. I never saw it until now. I never saw you, the real you, the woman who deserves so much more than I could ever give you." Her shoulders stiffened, and then, slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes were dry now, but the hurt was still there, etched into her soul, branded into her heart. "You should have seen me before," she replied quietly, her voice steady, no longer filled with the trembling sorrow that had once ruled her. "Before I gave everything to you. Before I let you take me for granted." She took a deep breath, the words coming out like a release, like a burden lifted. "I gave you everything," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of years of love, of devotion, of pain. "But you were never truly mine to keep, were you, Alex?" His chest tightened, and the lump in his throat felt like a stone, impossible to swallow. No, he wasn't hers to keep, not anymore, because he had lost her, for good. The door stood open, and the cool night air flooded into the room, sweeping in the remnants of their past, the coldness that had settled between them. For the first time, Isabella was the one walking away. Alexander had spent so many years controlling everything, pushing people away, hiding behind his power and his wealth. But now, it was her who was leaving him behind. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, the hollowness that had consumed him. It was a feeling he had never known, and it was worse than anything he had ever experienced. She had always been there, standing by his side, believing in him even when he didn't deserve it. She had loved him with a depth that he couldn't even fathom. And now she was leaving. But just as he thought she was gone for good, she stopped. She stood in the doorway, her back to him, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Alexander's heart was beating erratically, his body frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Was it really over? And then, in a voice that carried the weight of everything she had endured, Isabella spoke. Her words were quiet, yet they echoed through the silence of the room like a thunderclap. "You broke me, Alexander," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "But you didn't destroy me." Those words hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with such force that he felt like he was drowning in them. For the first time in years, Alexander didn't know what to say. The magnitude of what she had just spoken left him speechless. She was leaving him, but she wasn't broken. She had been shattered, yes, torn apart by the betrayal, the lies, the heartache. But she had somehow managed to stand tall, to rebuild herself in the face of the destruction he had caused. She had become stronger than he ever realized. And in that moment, Alexander saw her for who she truly was, not the woman he had taken for granted, not the woman he had used and abused, but a woman who had survived, a woman who had found a way to rise, even after everything he had done. "You didn't destroy me, Alex," she repeated, her voice stronger now, filled with a quiet confidence he hadn't heard in years. "You broke me, but I'm not your broken toy to fix. I'm not your redemption project. I'm not the woman you can play with until you get bored." And then, with one final look, one that held no love, no hatred, only the calm of finality, she turned and walked out. He didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there, his heart heavy with regret, with sorrow, and with the realization that he had lost her forever. The door clicked shut behind her, and in that moment, Alexander Steele was left with nothing. The silence in the room was deafening, the emptiness suffocating. He had never felt so alone. Isabella was gone, but it wasn't just her he had lost everything. The woman who had once been his world had walked away, leaving him with only the wreckage of his own making, and he knew in the deepest parts of his soul that it was his fault. It was always his fault. Alexander Steele had it all. The sleek, polished office that overlooked the city where billion-dollar deals were made every hour, the fleet of cars waiting at his beck and call, the palatial penthouse with its stunning views, filled with expensive furniture and art that only spoke of his success, his wealth, his empire. But now, as he sat in the vast, empty room, surrounded by all his material accomplishments, Alexander realized that everything, the wealth, the power, the accolades, meant absolutely nothing. Because the one thing he truly needed, the one thing he had taken for granted, was gone. Isabella. The woman who had built him, who had loved him with everything she had, was no longer there. In the silence of the empty room, Alexander's mind raced. He thought back to all the moments, all the memories he had buried beneath his work and his ambition. The times Isabella had stood by him, the way she had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. The quiet support she had given him, never asking for anything in return. But he hadn't seen it. He hadn't understood it. He'd been too blinded by his own success, his own ego, and now he was left alone in the ruins of his own making. It was as if the world had faded into grayscale. The colors of his once vibrant life had dulled, and the people who once seemed so important, his colleagues, his friends, no longer mattered. They weren't the ones who had loved him. They weren't the ones who had seen him for who he truly was. But Isabella had, and now she was gone. For the first time in his life, he felt the true sting of loss. The loneliness in the pit of his stomach gnawed at him, and he couldn't escape it. He walked through the empty halls of his penthouse, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The grand, imposing furniture no longer felt like a symbol of his success. It felt like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He reached the bedroom. The bed they had once shared was now cold, untouched. He ran his fingers over the empty space where she had slept, where her warmth had once filled the room. Her scent was still in the air, a faint trace of jasmine and vanilla that clung to the pillows. His eyes stung with the force of his regret, and he sank to the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being the man she trusted, the man she loved, to the man who had torn their world apart? The realization hit him like a freight train. He had destroyed everything. He had destroyed her trust. He had destroyed the love she had given him. And now, the one person who had ever truly understood him was gone, and there was no going back. Alexander Steele had everything, the wealth, the power, the admiration of the world. But it was all empty, because he no longer had her. The woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, the woman who had fought for their love when he had given up, the woman who had loved him more than he had ever deserved. He realized now that she had always been the center of his world. He just hadn't seen it until she was gone. And now, as he sat there, surrounded by the trappings of his success, he understood that he would never have enough to fill the emptiness inside him. He had everything, except her. Months had passed since Isabella walked out of Alexander's life, and in that time she had done what he never thought possible. She had healed. She had found herself again in the wake of the destruction he had caused. Now, she stood in front of a crowd of thousands, the bright lights of the charity event illuminating her. But it wasn't just the lights that made her glow. It was her strength, her resilience, the raw power in her words. The event was for women who had been abandoned, betrayed, forgotten. Women who had once felt like they were too broken to continue, and as Isabella stood there, a beacon of hope for all of them, she knew she was no longer the woman who had once been torn apart by a love she had given everything to. She was more. Her heart had mended, her spirit had been reborn, and now her voice was an anthem for women everywhere who had faced the same pain she had. "You are enough," Isabella's voice rang out, steady and strong. The words carried through the room, filling the air with a quiet power. You don't need to beg for love. The right love will see you, choose you, and fight for you. But most importantly, you must choose yourself first. Her words struck like lightning. They pierced through the hearts of every woman in that room, touching places they had kept hidden for years. Places where their own worth had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal, abandonment, and the constant pressure to please others. Isabella had chosen herself, and in doing so she had given every woman in that room permission to choose themselves too. The room was silent for a moment, as if everyone was absorbing her words. And then a wave of applause erupted, filling the space with the sound of women who had found their voice again, who had found their strength through Isabella's example. Her speech went viral the very next day. The world took notice. What had started as a single moment of vulnerability, a simple act of standing up for herself, had transformed into a revolution. Isabella's strength became a symbol for every woman who had ever felt less than. Every woman who had ever been made to feel small, discarded, or unworthy of love. She was no longer just a woman who had been betrayed by the man she loved. She was a leader, a beacon of hope, a voice for those who needed it most. The world saw her now. Her story of pain had turned into a story of empowerment, a story of resilience that inspired millions. The woman who had once been broken was now leading a movement. As Isabella finished her speech, the room erupted into a standing ovation, but it wasn't just for the speech. It was for everything she represented. She had chosen herself, And in doing so, she had given every woman in that room, and every woman watching from the comfort of their homes, the courage to do the same. Her message had shaken the world, and in that moment, Isabella knew that she had finally found her purpose. Not in Alexander's love, but in the love she had rediscovered for herself. She had fought for herself. She had risen from the ashes of her heartbreak, and now she was ready to fight for every woman who needed to hear those words, "You are enough." Alexander sat alone in the darkness of his penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows against the walls. The silence around him was suffocating, a reflection of the emptiness inside him. The sleek, polished furniture, the vast expanses of luxury, none of it mattered. His world felt like a hollow shell, a place he could no longer call home. The empire he had spent years building, the power and the riches, all seemed meaningless now. He sat in front of his laptop, the screen glowing in the quiet room. The video of Isabella's speech had gone viral, watched by millions, shared by countless voices, and praised by women all over the world. He clicked on the play button, his heart pounding in his chest. As soon as Isabella's voice filled the room, Alexander felt a sharp pain in his chest. The words, the power behind them, the conviction in her eyes, it was all too much. He had known her once, he had known that fire inside her, that strength beneath the surface. But to see it now, to see her transform into a leader, a symbol of hope for women everywhere, was a bitter reminder of what he had lost. "You are enough," her voice echoed in the room, as steady and unwavering as the woman she had become. "You don't need to beg for love. The right love will see you, choose you, and fight for you. But most importantly, you must choose yourself first." And in that moment, Alexander knew it. He had lost her forever. A tear slipped down his face, and he didn't try to stop it. The weight of the regret was too heavy, too suffocating to ignore. He had built an empire, but he had destroyed the most important thing in his life, her. Isabella had been his anchor, the one person who had stood by him when no one else had. She had loved him when he was broken, when he was unworthy, and yet he had pushed her away. He had betrayed her trust, taken her love for granted, and now she was out in the world, shining brighter than he had ever imagined, while he sat here in the ruins of his own decisions. The woman who had loved him was gone, and she wasn't coming back. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his hand covering his face. The tears came freely now, and he didn't try to stop them. He had been so consumed by his own ego, so blinded by his success, that he had failed to see the one thing that truly mattered, the woman who had always been there for him, the woman who had never given up on him, even when he had given up on them. And now, she was gone. Gone forever. The video finished, but the weight of Isabella's words lingered in the air, hanging over him like a dark cloud. He had watched her transform into something powerful, something unstoppable. She had found her voice, found her purpose, and now she was helping other women find theirs. But where did that leave him? He had everything, except her. The tears that had once been so distant, so foreign to him, now flowed freely. He realized now, with gut-wrenching clarity, that he had lost the greatest love of his life. The one love that could never be replaced. And this time, there was no second chance. No amount of money, no lavish cars or penthouses could ever bring her back. The regret would haunt him forever. Love is not just a word, it is a commitment, a choice, a responsibility. It is the foundation on which trust is built, and once that trust is broken, it leaves behind wounds that even time cannot fully heal. Isabella loved Alexander with a sincerity that was rare in a world obsessed with wealth and status. She stood by him when he had nothing, believed in him when the world doubted him, and loved him when he was just a man, not a millionaire CEO. But love, no matter how pure, cannot survive on its own. It needs respect, honesty, and effort. Alexander, blinded by his success and the illusion of having endless options, thought he could replace a woman who had given him everything. He believed he could trade loyalty for momentary pleasure, thinking he would never lose the one person who loved him beyond his riches. But love does not beg. Love does not wait for those who take it for granted. Love does not remain where it is unappreciated. Isabella's greatest pain was not losing Alexander. It was realizing that the man she had once loved had stopped valuing her. And when a woman realizes her worth, nothing can hold her back. She walked away, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She left not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to know that she deserved better. She turned her pain into power, her heartbreak into purpose, and her suffering into strength. And while Alexander was left with regret, she was reborn as a woman who knew her own worth. Never hold on to a person who treats you as an option while you make them a priority. Love is meant to be a two-way street. It is supposed to be built on mutual effort, mutual respect, and mutual appreciation. But too often we find ourselves holding on to people who do not value us the same way we value them. We invest our time, our energy, and our hearts into someone who only gives us half-hearted love in return. We rearrange our world for them, while they only fit us into their schedule when it's convenient. We make sacrifices, compromise, and stay up late waiting for a message that never comes, for a call that never happens, for love that is always just out of reach. And in doing so, we lose ourselves. We start questioning if we are enough. We start believing that maybe if we try harder, love them more, be more patient, or give them more time, they will finally see our worth. But here's the painful truth. The right person will never make you feel like you have to prove your worth. When someone treats you as an option, it means they are not afraid to lose you. It means they take your presence for granted, assuming that no matter how little effort they put in, you will always be there. It means they enjoy the comfort of your love without ever committing to it fully. And the longer you hold on, the more you betray yourself. Ask yourself, how many nights have you cried, waiting for them to care as much as you do? How many times have you made excuses for their absence, their coldness, their neglect? How many times have you stayed silent when your heart was screaming for them to love you the way you deserve? You deserve more. You deserve someone who chooses you every single day, not just when it's convenient. You deserve someone who sees your worth, not someone who makes you beg for attention, for time, for love. You deserve a love that is certain, not one that leaves you in doubt. It hurts to walk away. It hurts to let go of the dreams you built with someone who never truly saw you. It hurts to accept that the person you loved with all your heart only saw you as an option. But what hurts more? Staying and slowly losing yourself. When you let go of someone who doesn't value you, you are not losing love. You are making space for the right love to find you. When you walk away from someone who treats you as an option, you are choosing yourself over their indifference. When you stop holding on to a one-sided love, you are reclaiming your power. You deserve to be someone's first choice. You deserve to be loved without conditions, without games, without uncertainty. You deserve someone who fights for you, stands by you, and never makes you feel like you are not enough. So today, make a promise to yourself. Never settle for being an option. Let go of those who do not see your worth. Walk away from those who only take but never give. Choose yourself, because the right love will never make you beg for what you deserve. Have you ever held on to someone who treated you as an option? How did you find the strength to walk away? Share your story in the comments. If you believe in self-worth, type "I choose myself" in the comments. Subscribe for more powerful stories and lessons on love, self-respect and healing.